So the good news keeps on coming for Bernie Sanders. A new poll just released demonstrates that he has massive and growing support among American college students. This poll demonstrates that Bernie Sanders has 43% support among college students, which is a massive lead over Elizabeth Warren in second place, and of course over the rest of the field. And this lead is growing and has been growing since October at the very least. But this might not seem like a surprise, you might be saying. Isn't the stereotypical Bernie Sanders supporter, a young, white college male? And maybe you'd say that, of course, Bernie Sanders does well among college students. That's who always talks about Bernie Sanders. That's the Bernie bro demographic. That's the narrative. That's the stereotype. But that's where this data is especially interesting, because they also specifically asked Black college students and Latino/Latina college students, and the data there is even more impressive for Bernie. With Black students, Bernie Sanders has 49% support, and with Latino/Latina students, with Hispanic students, Bernie Sanders has 50% support. Those are effectively majority numbers among Black and Latino college students, even though this is a massive race still with half a dozen to a dozen people contesting the nomination. And Bernie is beating them all combined with Latina students. It's an incredible result. And it shows that the narrative around Bernie Sanders and his base has always been misleading. Going back to 2015, 2016, there was this understanding that Bernie Sanders' support was almost exclusively young and white, and that people of color did not like Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders had always done at least reasonably well with younger people of color. But in this contest, in the 2019-2020 cycle, Bernie is showing that he dominates with young people of color. He dominates with Black and Hispanic students. He's showing that he is building a broad and diverse coalition of young people who want to transform society for the better. And this is the sort of narrative buster that must be very, very concerning to the anti-Bernie media and to people like Joe Biden. Because again, the whole story about Bernie is that his support was clustered among young white people, and that's fine and dandy, but he's not going to be able to win the primary or the general with that narrow base of support. But we see this poll. And of course, the CNN poll we covered on this channel just a couple days ago demonstrated that Bernie Sanders beats Joe Biden by 3 points among voters of color total, among all voters of color, not just young students, but among all people who are voters of color. That's showing that increasingly, that among America's racialized population, Bernie Sanders is becoming, if not the explicit candidate of choice, then he's now at least rivaling Joe Biden for that distinction. And I think this information in this poll is incredibly important. Bernie Sanders is fighting for everyone, but specifically, his message has a real resonance with young people. These are young college students. So in many ways, these are the kids, quote unquote, doing everything right. They're going to school, they're investing in themselves, they're preparing for the workforce, and on and on and on. And yet they know that their education is incredibly expensive. They'll be saddled with debt. Housing will be inaccessible. They won't have good jobs in many cases. Jobs will be precarious. Many of the jobs will not offer good things like health insurance and other benefits and pensions and stable retirements. They know that on all of these fronts, not to mention climate change, that the world they're being given is not as good as the world their parents were given in so many ways. And they're unhappy and they're anxious and they're looking for support from the political class, and they're not finding very much at all. And that's why Bernie Sanders is so dominant among young college students. This isn't the case that Bernie is winning in a clustered field. Bernie is crushing everybody else because no one else is even coming close to speaking to the concerns and desires and needs and hopes and fears of young students in America, be they white, be they Black, be they Hispanic. No one else is coming close. That's why Bernie Sanders is leading among this population. And I think that's a good thing because at the end of the day, We have a lot of goals in politics. We have a lot of goals when we cast our ballot. We have short-term needs, medium-term needs, and long-term needs. But in general, I would like to hope and think that as a society, a global society, as a national society, what have you, that our objective should be to leave a better world than the one we were given when we were born. That as we pass on as a generation, as we pass on individually, that we did what we could, how we could, when we could, to leave a better world for our children and grandchildren than our parents and grandparents left for us. And one of the ways you can do that is look to the young people. Look to the young people and where they're moving. Not every young person supports Bernie Sanders, of course, but if you look at this data, Bernie Sanders is absolutely dominant relative to everybody else. Clearly, the young people have made their choice. Clearly, the young people have picked a direction, and it's with Bernie Sanders. And so if you're asking, how can we speak to the concerns of the future? Look to the future. Look to the people who are that future. Look to the people who are concerned about a future without good jobs, a future of growing inequality, and a future of shrinking opportunity. Look to the generation that is more than anybody else fighting for civil rights for themselves and for others so that, their children and grandchildren can grow up in a more fair and humane society. And look to the generation that knows it's going to disproportionately bear the brunt of climate crisis and injustice, and look at who they're entrusting to help them solve those issues before they become unsolvable potentially. And on all of those issues, young students, young people, they're picking Bernie Sanders. Everybody should be looking. How are the young people moving? Young people need to get themselves to the polls. That's 100% true. Young people, if they don't go to the polls, Bernie Sanders won't be able to win. They need to go and back Bernie at the polls with all the gusto that senior citizens will go and vote for Joe Biden. If they don't, Biden's going to win, and then he's going to lose to Trump, and then Trump's going to be president, and things are going to continue to be crappy. That's what's going to happen. But also, older folks, you got to cast your vote not just for yourself, but for the next generation. For the young people who are just now being able to vote, or for those young people who are engaged in social and political and economic and environmental justice, but aren't old enough to vote yet, those people, they're lining up behind Bernie Sanders too. Cast your vote for them. Cast your vote for the next generation. Cast your vote to build a better world. Cast your vote to build a better world than the one you were given. If we can all do that, we can know that at the end of our lives, we made a difference. And one of the things you can do in the short term, it's not everything, of course. The fight will not end even if Bernie Sanders wins. But if you make Bernie Sanders the nominee and the president, that's a big step forward for this generation and for the ones coming still.